Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mark Warner coming to you for the first time in many weeks on a non-Zoom function. I do have my handy mask with me. I'm up on the Capitol, at the Capitol, and re-entering the process of active participation. I want to start by hoping that all of you and your family and friends are all safe as we continue to struggle with this extraordinarily unprecedented time. I want to make sure we've got plenty of time for questions, but I do want to go through 3 or 4 items at the top and then be happy to take questions on COVID or any other related topic. I think we're still at this moment of enormous economic stress as we enter now into this second full month of the period of both lockdown and people's economic uncertainty. Obviously, the numbers: 30 million Americans uninsured, over 570,000, I believe, in terms of the last week numbers of Virginians. People hitting, I think the May 1st timeline of, what can I pay my rent? Can I pay my mortgage? Can I pay my rent or pay my student debt? An enormous economic stress being caused by the virus. On top of that, we've got the $2.7 trillion of direct federal relief and close to $4 trillion on top of that of lending coming from the Federal Reserve. And while those numbers are remarkable, literally 8 times the size of TARP, I think most Virginians, most Americans' reaction is, that sounds great. Where is my money? Where are my checks? And there still remains some challenges. While I think the direct payments are getting out, and I think our unemployment system in Virginia is now getting out some of the dollars with both the expanded checks and an area that I've fought for long and hard. And I think one of the actual real benefits silver linings of an otherwise awful period was the expansion of unemployment to cover independent workers, gig workers, 1099ers, freelancers. The remarkable thing is, prior to this virus, only about 30% of Virginia's workforce was covered by traditional unemployment. That universe has been greatly expanded, and one of the things I'm going to be working on in going forward legislation is how we make sure that we continue that expansion in terms of people covered and actually move to experiment with portable benefits. We need to realize we're not going to go back to a 20th century economy. People are going to continue to have different modes of work, particularly post-virus, and with that work ought to come benefits that are portable. And then an awful lot of attention, and I'll wait for the questions on this, on the PPP program. Again, well-intentioned, and funds are starting to get out, and I think in a fairer way than in the first round, but we're still reading too many stories of either public companies receiving funds or the case of businesses that have not seen any revenue loss receiving funds. Frankly, neither of those were intended, and I think most Virginians, most Americans' response to that is rightful anger if they're seeing companies that are not hurting getting some of these extraordinarily important grants. On the virus itself, we have seen our numbers go up in Virginia. I think that is mostly related to increased testing. I'm still bitterly disappointed with the administration's failure to have a coordinated approach on PPE. While we have finally I think, got our sea legs on the equipment around gowns and gloves and masks, I can tell you as recently as last Friday, still having a conference call with a lot of nonprofits in the Richmond area that were in the health field that still didn't have adequate PPE. And the fact that we have literally hospital system competing against hospital system, state competing against state, the 2 results of that is it's both driven up the costs of this equipment, and as we try to source particularly this equipment from foreign sources, we're going through a whole set of hurdles trying to identify valid sources that wouldn't have to have taken place if we'd had a national response. And while as problematic as the issue was on PPE, we're now entering into the next phase which is even more important and critically important as as the governor Northam moves to reopen the economy, and that is testing, testing, testing. This is not a question of finances. We put forward $25 billion to provide funding for both developing testing and the paying for tests. Virginia has dramatically upped its number of daily tests. I think it's more than doubled their average number of tests literally in the last week. But we're going to need, exponentially more testing if we're going to be able to fully reopen. People are going to need both screening on temperature, but also on some ability to do testing in a much more fulsome way. And again, this is an area where the president and the White House need to use the powers that they've been assigned, the Defense Production Act, to have a concerted, organized federal effort. This should not be given to the president's son-in-law, where he brings in a bunch of friends and cronies to kind of have some volunteer effort when people's lives are at stake. That's why I've joined legislation that would require the president to use the full tools of the Defense Production Act to make sure that we've got an accurate database of what kind of testing is available, what's coming online. I've made that request repeatedly to the vice president and have met deafening silence. And I say that as somebody who was chosen by the president to be on his reopening task force. But the fact that there is not a master database at the federal level is a huge error and something that I think is slowing a coordinated response. It's driven me, frankly, to work actually with Johns Hopkins University over the last 3 weeks. So they, a trusted source that has created a website that's measured the growth of the virus, they are now creating what I hope will be what should have been created by the federal government, but would be a master database in terms of how much testing is provided, what type of testing, whether it's the swab testing or the serology test about antibodies, what is in the pipeline in terms of FDA approvals. We need that information as policymakers. Mayors need it, governors need it, and Hopkins went live with their site last Wednesday. And while not complete at this point, I think is a step in the right direction. One last item before we move to questions, and that is there's a lot of beginning conversation about what a next COVID package would look like. I've put forward a proposal called the Paycheck Security Act that has actually been embraced by folks to my left like Bernie Sanders, folks that are very conservative in the Democratic Party like Doug Jones. There's a similar Republican proposal from Republican Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri that says maybe before we simply re-up some of these existing programs, we should take a time out and look at what's working around the world. I think most economists from left to right have said what the European approach with direct government support to payrolls. Our proposal would have 100% of pay up to $90,000 of pay level for those workers who've been furloughed so that we can reconnect those workers back to their workplace. The government would pay that directly. We could use the payroll processors. We can also use the employee retention tax credit as means of delivery. But if we look at our European neighbors and the Canadian approach, they've seen only a slight uptick in unemployment, not the 30 million plus that we've seen in our nation, not the close to, we'll see later this week whether we go north of 15% in terms of unemployment. If we had this paycheck support initiative, that would keep people connected, which would be valuable in terms of restarting the economy, but would also be valuable when we think about those 30 million Americans who've lost their jobs, many of which who've also lost their health care by losing their jobs. This reconnection with the employer, I think, would be a stronger and more sustainable approach. It also would take into consideration, the fact that at this moment in time, our assistance at the federal level has been very generous to one industry, the airline industry, and again, pretty generous to those small businesses under 500 employees who've managed to access funds through PPP. That mid-level market, those businesses from 500 to 10,000 employees, many of them not public companies. We have a lot of these businesses, mid-sized manufacturers around Virginia, have received basically no support at all. And this Paycheck Security Act would be a way to provide that direct government support, again, to those workers who are furloughed. We'll have more information about that, as well as cost estimates coming out in the next day or so. So, top line here is great economic uncertainty. We're seeing the federal government response. We still have, obviously, challenges around the virus. Those challenges, in particular, we're going to need greatly enhanced testing. And I would argue, before we simply re-up well-intentioned but not necessarily successful programs in the previous COVID acts, that maybe we step back and take a look at this direct payroll support that, again, has been embraced by folks from left to right. Even the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal have both said good things about it, and it's very rarely that you get both of those periodicals saying anything in common. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to you all for questions, and again, I hope everybody is safe and sound. Who's got the first question?
Senator, this is Bill Ack, the Progress Index in Petersburg. I have a question pertaining to HBCU funding. Recently, you and Senator Kaine announced that HBCUs across Virginia were going to be getting about $36 million as part of that $1 billion federal aid package for minority institutions. And just a couple of days before you all announced that, the president of Virginia State University sent a letter to Congressman Scott on the House Education Committee requesting an additional $1.5 billion for what he called the Council of 1890s institutions, of which many of those are HBCUs. At what point do you become concerned that HBCUs, given their history of, as Governor Northam said, been playing second fiddle to other higher ed institutions in terms of funding, at what point do you become concerned that might appear they're going to the well once too often and just trying to use the crisis as possibly trying to rectify that historical misdeed?
Well, Bill, I actually think the money to these HBCUs that have already come down, and I am supportive of additional designated funding. I served on the board of Virginia Union. I'm very familiar with the HBCUs in Virginia. They provide a great education. And it is true, they have been disproportionately discriminated against. Most of them do not have large endowments. They need that ongoing revenue, as do many other small colleges around Virginia. So I think there is both the historical challenge, but the immediate challenge that without large endowments, they can't continue to function in a meaningful way if they don't get support. And while I'm pleased to see that first $1 billion, and Senator Kaine and I were pleased to see, I believe the number was $36 million distributed to those institutions, I am very supportive, particularly if we see the virus move into the fall, of additional support to HBCUs. I would also argue at a more macro level that one of the things that we didn't do probably enough for were institutions, higher education institutions. In the first CARES Act, or the bill that was passed, we actually call it CARES 3, but at the $2.2 trillion legislation, there was only about $14 billion put in for higher education writ large. That's public and private. And since we have been, I think, very underfunding direct aid to state and localities, Virginia only got about, $3.2 billion in direct state aid. And the governor's got a lot of people pulling on him about where that money's going to go. That means I think our public institutions, our smaller privates that don't have large endowments, they're all going to be under stress. And that stress is going to become almost unbearable if they're not able to have students return in the fall.
Senator, this is Caleb Perney at WCYB TV. I wanted to ask you about two things. One of them, Governor Northam was talking at his last press conference about the plan for reopening Virginia once the data shows that that's safe to do. Do you get a sense that the country's moving to a new phase of dealing with the pandemic? past a crisis point to something new? And a second question is Virginia, compared to other states, has been behind on the amount of testing they've done, and I was wondering if you have any idea about why that is, what has caused the ramp up to be slower here.
Well, let me take those in reverse order. I do think I think the governor appropriately initially focused on trying to make sure our hospitals had all the appropriate equipment, ventilators, others, so they weren't overwhelmed in a surge. I can tell you on an individual basis, as UVA, for example, developed its own testing regime, I lobbied folks at the FDA to make sure they got approved in a very expedited manner. I do think we've seen the numbers in Virginia jump dramatically, and even when Virginia was lower, I looked at that. I was concerned. I looked at, though, that these were all states that were literally a fraction of a point differential. They were all beneath the 1% testing penetration. Our numbers in Virginia have grown dramatically. I think we were at 6,000 or 7,000 tests the last couple of days, and we'd been, around 2,000 to 3,000 before. So a doubling of capacity. I think we're going to need more. The governor has set a goal of 10,000. I think we may even need more than that to give people the full comfort they need to re-enter the economy. And then in your previous question, your earlier question, I do think there is this move to reopen. I think people are obviously getting a little bit stir crazy. I think we are in this kind of experimental stage of seeing whether reopening with social distancing, with wearing masks, keeps the virus flat or declining. In many ways, a state like Georgia that's about 2 weeks ahead of the rest of the nation. I hope and pray that they don't see a spike in Georgia. But my concern, and one of the reasons why I have such confidence in Governor Northam, he's the only doctor as a governor in the whole country. We really have to weigh this kind of stir craziness, economic necessity of getting reopened with really appropriate social distancing, because the worst thing for Virginia, for people's livelihood, and for the economy would be this rush back to reopening unsafely and then have a spike. That would rob people of their confidence in their leadership, and it's a real delicate balance. Personally, I'm going to be watching what happens in Georgia. I hope and pray they're able to do this successfully. But I think the governor's kind of set the right tone with saying he's going to do this based on the science, based on the numbers. And one of the things I think we're going to have to look at as we look at the numbers, I think as we see increasing testing, we're probably going to see increasing cases. And I think we probably are going to need to move our metric a little bit, simply from being the number of cases to the number of hospitalizations or people on ventilators. If simply the number of cases are going up, but we're not seeing a dramatic uptick in hospitalizations, that may just be a factor that we've had those cases in the past. We just weren't recognizing them. And clearly the strange thing about the virus is, and I've seen different percentages, the number of people who get infected but are totally asymptomatic. And so this is all a real-time determination. But I would, final comment I'd make on your question is, I think it's too early to say that we're totally in the next phase of reopening and that we're post-crisis. I hope that's the case. I think we'll have better data on that probably middle of next week as states have started this reopening process. But both psychologically and everything else, to say that we're post-crisis, I think is too early to say. Post-healthcare crisis.
Hi, this is Mitchell Miller from WTOP.
Hey, Mitchell.
I wanted to ask you a question related to what would be coming next. As you know from just comments from senators on the floor over the last 24 hours, there's clearly a lot of differences between the two parties. the majority leader of the House, Steny Hoyer, today said he's still hoping for a bipartisan agreement, but he didn't rule out the fact that the House, if they come together with their legislation next week, could go ahead and vote on that on its own. Obviously, there's been a big push for state and local government. I just wonder if Republicans don't cross the aisle, if you will, and decide not to go along, how big of a problem do you think that could be for state and local governments, and do you worry that the parties and the two chambers can't come together on that over the next week or two?
Well, I think it was remarkable that in the first, actually all four bills, but the two big ones, the version 3 and what we've called 3.5, passed by virtually unanimous consent, a few opposition in the House. And I think that was a reflection, as dysfunctional sometimes as Congress is, that it actually rose to the occasion in this crisis. I am very worried about state and local funding, and I say that as a former governor. I say that as a former governor that fought hard to maintain our AAA bond rating. I frankly resent the president or anyone, a majority leader or anybody else that says, this is just some effort to bail out poorly managed states. Virginia has been extraordinarily well managed under both Democratic and Republican governors and under both Democratic and Republican legislatures. And to kind of malign states as irresponsible is frankly irresponsible by the people who are making those comments. But and I know the states don't have the luxury of the printing press. We actually have to balance our budgets. We do balance our budgets. Local governments have the same. And I think the resentment and pushback, whether you're a Kentuckian or a Virginian or a Californian, if you see your local government starting to lay off your fire department, your police department, your EMT, because they have had such a decline in local property, not so much property taxes, but meals taxes, hotel taxes, the kind of things where we've all known the economy's been hit, I think it is grossly irresponsible to not provide assistance to state and local governments. And I actually do believe, Mitchell, that the vast majority of my Republican colleagues understand that every bit as much as the Democrats do. Now, in the House, I hope they will work towards a bipartisan bill. I think the more we can maintain common agreement, that means both sides are going to have to give. The more we can show the American public that during this period we're going to put aside our differences and actually focus on the virus, focus on the economic harm that the virus has caused, the better. That would mean, I laid out my Paycheck Security Act. I'm more than willing to meet my Republican colleagues halfway. Again, Josh Hawley, very conservative senator from Missouri, he's got a different plan. I'd love to meet him somewhere in the middle to make sure that we provide that kind of support to workers and families who are being affected. So I'm still, this may be naive, but I'm actually hopeful that the House can find some agreement. And I can assure you, in the couple days that we've been back, I continue to have lots of private conversations with my Republican colleagues about how we can get to yes. I do sometimes feel like the leaders have to go through a little bit of this ping pong ball back and forth on positioning. I think there's a whole lot of us who are saying, hey, time to chuck our partisan hats and put the country first, because there's just too many Americans that are hurting.
Folks, we have time for about 2 more questions.
Daniela Cheto, WAMU.
Hey, go ahead.
So activists for immigrants and African Americans have told me they think Virginia's reopening too soon, and that without more testing and clear rules or laws for the workplace, frontline workers, who tend to be people of color, will be at risk, and they won't be able to not go to work because then they'll lose their unemployment. What do you think about that?
Well, listen, I think this virus has once again shown the disparities in our economy. Clearly, we've seen African Americans, Latino communities hurt disproportionately more. They are oftentimes those frontline workers. That being said, I think that the governor has laid out, I believe, a thoughtful approach. I think, as we've seen, from this governor. He will be willing to change if the facts change, to make sure that we protect all workers. I also think, though, that we're going to constantly need both more PPE, and I think we've gotten better on that, although at a price, as I mentioned earlier, where we're paying 2 and 3 times more than what we would have been paying if we'd had an organized federal response. On the testing issue, I think the governor is trying as hard to ramp up testing as possible, but this cannot be done simply on a statewide basis. Testing needs that federal organization. We need a master logistics person in charge, and frankly, we could partner with Walmart or partner with Amazon or partner with the Army, where there's logistics expertise. We should know what's coming online because the FDA knows what's in their approval process. The fact that we don't have transparent access to that information is going to mean the governor's job is harder. It's going to mean people are going to be less safe, and it is a huge failure of this White House not to use the tools that were put in place. The very reason you have a Defense Production Act is to try to have a coordinated federal response. I think it should have been used on PPE, but there's no one that I've talked to, at least privately, Democrat or Republican, that doesn't agree on testing. This has to be organized at the federal level. And again, I point out, we put up $25 billion of federal dollars to assist this. The money's there. It just needs to be organized and spent appropriately.
This is Michael Myers.
And Val, let's go ahead and take a couple more. I can be a little bit late to the next one because I want to make sure everybody who wants to ask as much as possible can get a question. Go ahead, please.
This is Michael Myers, the Times-Dispatch in Richmond. Senator, what are the potential compromises on that next package? On state and local government funding, the problem has been not just the amount of money available, it's been the restrictions on how it can be used. They can't really use it to bolster their budgets where they've lost revenues. On the other hand, I've read that the Republican leaders have wanted to have some sort of relaxation, a guarantee of liability for employers, exemption from liability for employers who, as they reopen, which goes to the previous questioner about the vulnerabilities of workers. What does it look? What does the compromise potentially look like in the Senate?
Well, Michael, first of all, I think there is, and I'm hoping for some guidance shortly on this that will provide some level of relaxation on the idea that a state or a locality couldn't use these funds for a loss of revenue. I mean, to me, that was an absurd restriction put in place. Now, I got no problem saying a state can't use this to refill their pension fund. Fine, have it that. But the idea that if you've lost revenues, that somehow that's not directly COVID related enough. I mean, I know in Virginia there was thought that, could we extra use some of the rainy day fund, and that would be more directly tied to COVID-19, and do some workaround. Makes no sense. We are replacing and funding hospitals because they've lost revenues. We are funding small businesses because they lost revenues. We're doing direct grants to airlines because they lost revenues. Somehow why you would say we're going to exclude state and local governments who've lost revenues from using that to make up those lost revenues is absurd in the extreme. So I think that will get worked through. I think there will be, and if you want to put a prohibition to give a talking point to somebody to say you can't use this to bail out some pension fund, have at it. But in terms of the basic operations of state and local government, those are essential functions, and federal aid ought to be able to assist that. On the question of liability, I understand that, whether it's, because one of the challenges, the governor, for example, has lifted the restriction on elective surgery. But we're going to need to kind of do almost a public relations campaign to encourage people to go back to the hospital, for that elective surgery. If it's needed, get it done. If you've got a chronic disease, you need to get it taken care of, or the health care cost will even be greater downstream. And recognizing that there may be some kind of adjustments on liability, that is a fair discussion to have. But to say there's going to be an absolute prohibition so that if a business is completely negligent in terms of protection of the workforce, that to me is a non-starter. So I hope this is simply posturing. As in so many of these debates, there is a legitimate point that we're in an unprecedented time, and there may be certain businesses that you can't fully get the full 6 feet just on an assembly line. But that doesn't mean, you don't have an obligation to still provide PPE to your workers. So, rational people ought to be able to sort through this in a way. If you want to get to yes, there's a way to get to yes on issues both around fulfilling the holes on revenues and making sure that people can go back in a safe environment, but that businesses aren't in a extraordinarily unprecedented area where if they just can't get in certain things done just because of the nature of their business, they're precluded from reopening. But you got to start with that will to get to yes. And my hope is, just as we saw some posturing back and forth on the 2 earlier COVID packages, that some of the language right now may just be posturing, and that maybe more responsible members in both parties can quietly find that way to get to yes.
And I just want to remind everyone to please mute yourself unless you're...
Hi, my name's Aisha Tolliver. I'm with Wavy TV out of Portsmouth, Virginia. Sure. We've had concerns from military families, especially about, slowly returning back to their offices, but the limit still being, 10 children out of daycare effect until probably June 10th. Where do you feel like the priority should be as far as daycares and the reopening process?
I think the daycare issue is one of the most challenging. I know we put, for example, some additional funding in for daycare support for absolutely critical workers. I know for families to be able to have the ability to go back to work, if you got 2 income earning families, you got to have some place for your kids to go. The actual answer here is I would defer to the experts. I don't know how you structure a daycare setting with active 3-year-olds that practice 6-foot distancing. I'm not going to try to give you some answer here where I don't know the answer. It is a real problem. It is a real necessity for folks who are trying to get back to work. I gotta believe, and this is something I'll do some more research on how you set up that daycare experience that both protects the daycare workers and the kids. But it's something we're going to have to fully solve, I think, to get the kind of economic reopening that we want in a safe manner. But it's a very fair question. And it also goes to a question I'm still trying to get a full answer on as well of, when are we going to make sure, particularly for our military, both active duty and particularly deployed, that I think every member of the military active duty ought to be able to get access to a test. And how we ramp up that and make that a key priority as well is something I'm fighting for.
Senator Warner, Senator at WFLS. The governor has been opposed to opening Virginia regionally. Do you agree with this, or do you think that maybe it might be better to treat Northern Virginia separately, differently than Southwest and Central Virginia?
Listen, as a former governor, I try not to weigh in on any of my successors, and I want to have a further conversation with the governor on this matter. But Virginia is a huge state. And I have said publicly that I hope the governor will consider looking at this on a regional basis. It's hard for me to imagine where I live, Northern Virginia, that you could open Northern Virginia without doing that in concert with D.C. and Maryland. I think about Bristol, Virginia, where Bristol, Tennessee, and Bristol, Virginia, State Street cuts that town right in half. And I know Tennessee has moved more aggressively on that reopening. It's hard for me to think again how you're going to be able to do that without some regional basis. Things get a lot more complicated as we think, regionally. You can think about the valley as one area. When we think about the Richmond through the peninsula into Hampton Roads, I get the governor's concerns about how you would think about that on any kind of rational regional basis. So, I'm going to follow the governor, but I do think there needs to be some consideration of regions. And I think many other states are looking at it that way as well. Anyone else? I'll take one more, and then I got to head back to another session.
Well, I would jump in. It's Mike Gooding down at Channel 13.
Oh, shy and retiring Mike Gooding. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, I was being polite today. Let me just ask about the welfare of our military folks. 1,100 people on the USS Theodore Roosevelt, 95 people on the USS Kidd. Yet yesterday, Secretary Esper says we've remained ahead of the curve at every turn, and I'm very proud of what we've done. And he points out that in an active and reserve component of 2 million people, they only have 5,000 that have tested positive. So he says the military is doing a fine job. What do you think?
Respectfully, I disagree with the Secretary. I think both the failure to get adequate testing fast enough to the Teddy Roosevelt, I think the dismissal of the captain there who had the temerity to speak up to protect the safety of his crew. I understand chain of command, but I felt, and I'm forgetting for a moment, Mike, the captain's name, and I do hope he gets reinstated. And I know when I do these Facebook Lives, I get a question every time. Why don't we have a right to make sure that every active duty member has access to a test? And it's hard for me to give a reasonable answer why that is not a higher priority. So I know the military, like the rest of our country, has been hit by this, and we weren't fully prepared across the board. But anyone that claims roaring success, and that seems to be the message that comes from the White House, seems to me disconnected from the reality that our fellow Americans and fellow Virginians are living. And I don't want to end on that note, but let me again tell you thank you all. Again, appreciate everybody's interest. I'll try to do this on a very regular basis. I do think, I know we didn't get to national intelligence in our hearing yesterday, but there are things going on that are outside of COVID-19. But I believe that our most essential responsibility, when the majority leader called us back into session, and for me it was easy, I live close, but a number of my colleagues who had to take a couple of flights or had to drive across the country, my hope would be that the majority leader would have a schedule that focuses on what the next level of relief package ought to look like, as well as oversight on what will be the largest and fastest amount of federal spending in our whole country's history. Think about that for a moment. We're putting $2.7 trillion out in a few months, with $4 trillion of additional in terms of lending through the Federal Reserve Bank. That much money is going to create some level of mischief. And my appeal to him has been, let's focus on overseeing responsibly that taxpayer money rather than simply trying to stack the courts with the president's judicial appointees. We can get back to that when our economy is fully reopened. In the interim, let's stay focused on COVID. Thanks, everybody, and be safe.